Trump has continually threatened since the day he became president that he's going to personally get involved in Gaza in the sense of sending in troops, but if you're asked, he'll say we won't send in troops. So he's really just threatening that the war will return. I think that in principle could happen if the deal broke down, but I don't think we expect any American action against Hamas.
Now, on the front page of the Times this morning, Donald Trump says he'll make Hamas disarm after video emerged of the militant group killing suspected collaborators, their words, in Gaza. Donald Trump told reporters he will make sure the group gives up its weapons.
We have told them we want to disarm, and they will disarm. And if they don't disarm, we will disarm them. And it'll happen quickly and perhaps violently. But they will disarm. Do you understand me?
Yes. You say
because
quickly.
Everyone says, oh, well, they won't disarm. They will disarm. And I spoke to Hamas, and I said, you're going to disarm, right?
Donald Trump also spoke about Hamas publicly killing its enemies.
You know, they did take out a couple of gangs that were very bad, very, very bad gangs, and they did take them out, and they killed a number of gang members. And that didn't bother me much, to be honest with you. That's okay. We had a couple of very bad gangs. You know, it's no different than other countries.
Meanwhile, Israel says it will now only allow half of the agreed number of aid trucks into Gaza. Well, political analyst Arieh Kovler joins us now from Jerusalem. Good morning.
Good morning.
We heard there from President Donald Trump. I mean, lots of people have been quite concerned about the ability to disarm Hamas. Where do things stand now this morning in terms of getting Hamas to put down its weapons and essentially fulfill the terms of this agreement?
Well, look, there's kind of two or three different pieces here. One is, does Hamas get to remain the government of Gaza? Now, Hamas is saying it has no intention of doing that. It's willing to step down and hand over to someone, as long as it's the right someone. And so a lot of the debate in the next coming weeks and months on this phase two will be who that someone is and how that all works. The question of arms is also twofold. One is, Israel doesn't want Hamas to be a threat to it. But it also says if Hamas remains the biggest military force, the biggest armed force in Gaza, it doesn't really matter who says they're the government. The guys with the guns will still be in charge. So the question is how do you disarm Hamas in a way that also gets them out of government? Now, Hamas has kind of indicated it's willing to do a certain amount of disarmament, basically give up heavier weapons, but they're not going to put down their guns. And I think, how you nuance that. Would Trump consider it disarmament if they gave up big rockets but kept their guns? I guess we'll see in the coming months.
I mean, how seriously should people take that warning there from Donald Trump, who was essentially threatening violence against Hamas if they don't do what he's asking them to do?
I don't think anyone's taking it very seriously, honestly. Trump has continually threatened since the day he became president that he's going to personally get involved in Gaza in the sense of sending in troops, but if you're asked, he'll say we won't send in troops. So he's really just threatening that the war will return. I think that in principle could happen if the deal broke down, but I don't think we expect any American action against Hamas.
And in terms of how Israel is looking at this, I mean, we've heard that Israel is restricting aid. We referenced what happened in terms of the IDF and the shooting yesterday. Is there a sense that from the Israeli side that there is almost a sort of hesitation in fulfilling the commitments here too? Could this go backwards quickly?
Look, anything's possible. I would say things seem to be back on track overnight. Israel was talking about holding up some of the new aid and the reopening of the Rafah crossing because Hamas only gave 4 bodies of hostages when it was supposed to give a rather larger number. Since that time, last night at 10 p.m., Hamas gave another 4 bodies, some of which have already been identified. And supposedly today there's going to be another 4 or 5 transferred. That's enough for Israel to say and to be briefing this morning that these threats of reducing the aid and closing the border, this is not going to happen, and we're back on track on that. And that's the latest that I'm hearing. When it comes to the shootings, I think one thing that we're going to see throughout the ceasefire is there are still a lot of Israeli troops in Gaza beyond the agreed yellow line. And there are going to be times when they feel threatened, then they see groups of men moving towards them and think they might be armed. I think this is a ceasefire in which there's going to be no shooting. It's going to be a ceasefire that looks a bit more like Lebanon, where there's almost actually an Israeli attack in Lebanon now every day against the Hezbollah position. But it doesn't escalate further because Hezbollah is essentially deterred from doing so. So I think that is what the ceasefire is likely to look like in the coming weeks and months. Unfortunately, it's not a ceasefire in which there's going to be no shooting, but there's not going to be kind of ground operations or intense military operations, rather kind of small actions that Israel
Yeah.
frames as defensive.
And in terms of the political agreement, the new body, if you like, there's been a talk of Tony Blair being on that body. Where are we now in terms of the agreement of the membership and what that body will do?
Really nowhere at all. It's all up in the air. Actually, the Palestinian Authority quite likes Tony Blair, it seems, but Hamas don't want him. And the question of whether they get the veto. Different Arab countries have different views on this. We don't know which countries are going to be involved. Obviously, the Americans are, and some of the Arab nations. We don't know which Palestinians will be. Everything is up in the air. That's a long way away. I think we're going to have a longish period of months in which Hamas remains the government of Gaza, which Israel remains inside the Gazan border. Aid comes in. And there'll be pressure on, how we get to a period of a new government for Gaza reconstruction.
Finally, we have all been watching the scenes of the hostages, the living hostages being reunited with family members. We are now starting to hear about some of the living conditions that they faced during their time with Hamas. What for you kind of stands out so far when you listen to some of those stories of people who have been returned?
Well, it's very interesting. Almost all of the hostages talk about how they were heartened by hearing the protests inside Israel, the rallies for them, and internationally. And as someone who attended some of those rallies, there was something to that feeling like you were actually reaching them on the ground in Gaza. It wasn't just a kind of domestic political thing or just to make myself feel better. It had a real impact. It's clear that some of them were kept in really appalling conditions, essentially in solitary confinement for 2 years. A lot of them, it seems, were fed up in the last, not fed up, but like fed in the last week or two to try and make them more presentable after having previously been skeletal. But that carries health risks, which is one of the reasons they're in hospital now. And just kind of seeing how many of them never gave up hope throughout this period.
Yeah, it's such an important point to remember, and I know that we will start to hear more of those stories over the coming days and weeks. Arieh, thank you as ever for joining us there to give us the latest. That's Arieh Kovler joining us from Jerusalem.